Hi Tim, so thank you for joining us for this recorded blended session about your approach to hybrid learning in your school and sort of online and blended learning. So just to begin, could you just sort of introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your role and the school that you are based in?
Yeah, sure. So I am an English teacher at NIST International School, which is an international school in Bangkok, in Thailand. I've been working there for 3 years now, and as well as an English teacher, I'm also the head of Year 12. When I joined the school, it was just 6 months later that the pandemic started, and so I've not got through a full year yet of actually being in the classroom, but we've kind of been moving between online teaching and learning and in person, and then a little bit of hybrid as well.
Brilliant. So, and we were really interested to speak to you really because obviously most of the teachers that we're working with are kind of UK based or Europe based, and so the context is a bit different. And then also I know that a lot of the approaches were quite different, and that there have been sort of different stages to the response of your school to the pandemic. So I wondered if you could just kind of describe the sort of the journey that you've been on, the different approaches that you've taken since sort of like March 2020 and how it's evolved.
Yeah, so initially I think it was in March or April 2020. It was a long time ago now, it feels. But we went to a full online model, and we finished off that year online. We have a similar, roughly the same term time as in the UK. And that was just, yeah, fully online. We were quite lucky in that, I mean, we're a very well-resourced school. And, students will have laptops and, good internet access. And also because there's a quite a big problem in Bangkok where at times of poor air quality, schools were closing sometimes due to the air quality. It's sort of like the equivalent of a snow day. And so we were losing enough time that we were doing some online. We'd already started training both staff and students on how to do online learning. So we sort of knew about Zoom before it was big. And and like we're using Google Classroom and these kind of online tools already, and we'd even done a couple of practice days, like half days, where kids don't come in, so that they knew what to do in the event of a school closure. And then that happened. We were doing that just before we went online because of COVID. And then we did, several months online, and then we were lucky enough that things were quite good in Thailand compared to many parts of the world, so we were able to open again in the start of the 2021 school year. But then since then, we've kind of been back and forth a little bit. And we had the first half of the first 3 months of this school year, we were online. And then we did a 2-week period of hybrid learning. And then we are now back in school.
And I know, so one thing that I think is quite interesting to reflect on kind of at this stage is a lot of our colleagues in the schools that we work with have been talking to us about the sort of challenge of including children that are perhaps at home because they're not unwell, they're self-isolating, but they can't come into school, and how to kind of accommodate that in the way that they're teaching. And I know that like kind of simultaneous in-person and online teaching is an approach that some schools are thinking about, kind of ways that they can deliver that. So can you sort of talk to us a bit about what do you think what do you think that schools need to consider or needs to be in place in order for an approach like that to be workable?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm speaking very much from the point of view of a classroom teacher rather than administrator or school leader. And we did 2 weeks in the transition between online and fully in person, where we had the students in two groups. There's like group one and group two, and so we'd have group one on for 2 days and then group two on for the following 2 days. And so it meant in practice you had anywhere, it was sort of unevenly split in classes, but you'd have maybe half the class or a third of the class in person for a couple of days, and then it would flip to the other half. And then we were teaching simultaneously on Zoom, in those lessons for the students back at home. And it was really, really hard, actually. It was really challenging. We'd kind of got used to online learning and figured out some good ways of doing that. And I think we managed to do it so that while I don't think it was ever as good as in-person teaching and learning, I don't think we lost too much ground. Certainly in English, I think other subjects did. But from in English department, I think it's a subject where I think it's a little bit easier to run it on Zoom and then Google Classroom, or from my experience anyway. And the hybrid model was really hard because you're sort of talking to some kids on Zoom and then you've got some people in front of you, and it feels very unnatural because I'd find myself talking to the kids in class and forgetting about the ones on Zoom, or vice versa. Also, you're glued to the single spot in the classroom because you need to be on camera. I initially tried to sort out things with like an iPad in the corner to get like 2 camera angles, but you get all sorts of complicated things, echoes as well. And you know, when you want kids in the class to talk and you want kids at home to hear, it's not being picked up on your mic, so you have to mute yourself and turn your volume down, and then get the kid who's talking to unmute themselves. And it's like logistically so challenging. And also as a teacher, you know, I found it hard to concentrate on asking questions and just your teaching practice, because I felt like I was managing so much tech all the time. And I felt like I needed like a producer to deal with it all. I think we were doing it for such a short period of time as well. We did it for 2 weeks, that it meant that I never really figured it out. I think that it was always a sort of transitionary period where we were kind of testing out the COVID protocols and measures the school was putting in place to make sure that, you know, things like corridor flow and, you know, cafeterias and all that sort of stuff. So it was almost like to give us some time to trial going back in person. I think also one of the advantages we had was that we knew who was going to be in and who wasn't going to be in. Whereas I think in the UK, and actually now for us, you've got kids who are having to isolate because of exposure to, you know, someone with COVID or whatever. And that can be really unpredictable. So you need a system that is very flexible. So, I mean, I don't know, it's difficult. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who definitely didn't figure it out and just found it really tiring and stressful and difficult. So I suppose that's something to remember for everyone involved, that I suppose my advice for someone doing that would be to pare things back as much as possible. And, you know, really just try not to be too ambitious. I mean, the day I tried to use my iPad for like another camera angle, I did that for like half a day and then never again, because it just gets too complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I think that, and I think that's, yeah, you raised some really important points there in terms of partly about kind of what equipment is actually available to a school and what's feasible with that equipment, but then also the feasibility of actually expecting a teacher to manage all of that. I guess in a way you're talking about doing 2 jobs at once, really, and you're always going to struggle to do either of those things as well as you would want to if you're trying to do 2 things at the same time. So I suppose that being the case, then there being all these kind of practical considerations that might make that type of approach not particularly feasible for many schools. What do you think in an ideal world would you kind of be doing instead of that, in the circumstances that we've described, where maybe there are some children who are learning at home and some in school?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't have a brilliant answer, to be honest. I mean, I think that there are some things I think definitely help. So, you know, I came to rely on Google Classroom a lot more, and I know a lot of teachers in the UK, England have done that. You know, my brother teaches in London, and his sort of primary platform, I think, was Classroom. And so I'll post lesson resources and almost like a lesson plan on Classroom at the start of the lesson, and then, you know, kids at home could kind of follow along and keep track. So I think that's pretty crucial when you've got students at home. You know, I even wondered if we were going to do it for longer, looking at, I don't know, changing the schedule, timetable a little bit, and you kind of almost, or maybe in a lesson, some teachers I know are starting to experimenting with flipping the class, so they'd spend half the lesson with the kids in person while the other half at home worked on something independently, and then you flip it and works exclusively with the kids on Zoom and the kids in the classroom. So there were some really interesting practices going on in other, mostly in other people's classrooms. And I think that's an interesting way to go. I tried out some things like, you know, we wanted students at home to feel connected to what was going on in the classroom. So we tried buddying students up. So there was like an in-person student and then someone on Zoom, and they would work together. So the students in classroom would be on Zoom as well, and they could then work in breakout groups. But and I'm not sure if Zoom has the capability to make that work really smoothly yet. I wonder if they might go down that route if this sort of thing carries on. But it's quite clunky to make breakout groups in the moment in a class. So I think things like that. One thing that the school invested in, which I think is, I mean, I would imagine it's prohibitively expensive, is the system called Polycom, which is kind of it's a speaker and camera system that tracks the teacher and also tracks noise. So whoever's talking, it will like follow and zoom in on that person. And some teachers, we bought a limited number of those to trial them. And that's the idea being that the teacher can be free of the camera, doesn't have to be on Zoom sort of static, but can move around the room, and then and also the microphone responds to distance as well. And that some people absolutely love that. But I don't think we had enough of those for everyone to use them all the time. So, and I think that you do need, I don't know how much they cost, but I imagine they're not cheap. So I think it's the sort of thing where if you had longer doing it, then you would develop sort of strategies and ways of dealing with it. But and maybe I found it difficult when you want to integrate the students at home with those in class. But then that's a different proposition. If you have kids who are off for a week or two, you just need them to be able to not fall too far behind, right? Whereas we were operating a system where kids had been off for months already. And so we wanted them to feel connected to being in class in person, which I think we did okay at. But I think that it meant the pace of learning kind of was more challenging. It was a bit hard and slowed down a bit for that 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Yeah, there's just so many kind of considerations, and it's difficult, I suppose, given that it's hard for anyone to really have a strong sense of exactly what the situation is going to be like, even in a term or in a year's time. But thank you so much for sharing your kind of learning from your experience with this process, because obviously you've kind of taken some quite different approaches, and I think been quite experimental in your approach. And I know that a lot of people will appreciate hearing the sort of the results of those experiments. So thanks for sharing them with us.
No, not at all. No worries. Thanks so much.